All right, let's dive straight into this explainer and look at the absolute mechanics of purchasing power and monetary policy. We constantly hear words like inflation and deflation thrown around, but how often do we actually stop to visualize what they're doing to the system behind the scenes? To really visualize complex macroeconomics today, we're going to run a little thought experiment. We're going to represent your purchasing power as money noodles, where the number of noodles dictates what you can buy. Imagine the entire global economy is just a giant bowl of macaroni. Every single noodle represents a unit of purchasing power. So the total amount of groceries, housing, and goods you can afford is directly tied to how many of these noodles you hold, and more importantly, how much real value each of those noodles holds in the marketplace.
Act 1. The familiar annoyance. Let's start with the economic force you're probably most familiar with, inflation. It is the persistent, broad-based increase in the general price level of goods and services over time. The crucial takeaway here is that inflation reduces the purchasing power of your money. Basically, it takes more of your money noodles to buy the exact same loaf of bread. Your pile of noodles hasn't necessarily shrunk, but each individual noodle just doesn't buy as much as it did yesterday.
But where is this upward pressure actually coming from? Well, there are two primary engines that expand the money supply and drive this persistent price increase: demand pull and cost push. First up, we've got demand pull inflation. This happens when aggregate demand for goods outpaces aggregate supply. It's the classic scenario of too much money chasing too few goods. This perfectly illustrates situations like the post-pandemic stimulus, which, when combined with historically low interest rates, drove real estate and consumer goods prices absolutely skyward. Everyone rushed to buy at the exact same time, and since the supply of houses and cars couldn't just magically multiply overnight to meet that sudden explosion of cash, prices had literally nowhere to go but up.
On the flip side, there's cost push inflation. This kicks in when actual production costs rise. We're talking raw material shortages, supply chain bottlenecks, or sudden wage increases that force businesses to pass those costs directly onto consumers. A perfect historical anchor for this is the 1970s OPEC oil embargoes. That artificially constrained oil, which spiked energy costs across the entire global economy, pushing up the price of producing and transporting, well, pretty much everything. When the cost to make the goods goes up, the price you pay goes up.
Now, you might be wondering, why not just aim for zero inflation? Well, despite the daily annoyance of rising prices, central banks like the U.S. Federal Reserve actually aim for a low, predictable, positive inflation rate of around 2% annually. A tiny bit of inflation is a good thing. It encourages you to spend or invest your money today rather than hoarding it, simply because you know your cash will be worth slightly less next year. It acts as the necessary grease in the economic gears to keep the whole system moving forward.
Act 2. A delicious trap.
Let's pivot to the exact opposite scenario. Lower grocery bills sound fantastic, right? Who wouldn't want to pay less at the register? But as we'll see, deflation, the persistent broad-based decrease in the general price level of goods and services over time, is an incredibly dangerous trap. Under deflation, the purchasing power of your money actually increases. Your uninvested cash gains real value over time, meaning tomorrow your exact same pile of money noodles will naturally buy you a bigger house or a nicer car without you having to lift a finger.
But here's the catch. When we look at who actually wins, there's a fascinating contrast here. During inflation, debtors win because they get to pay back their loans with cheaper dollars. But under deflation, it strictly rewards cash holders and absolutely crushes debtors. Dropping wages make those heavy debt noodles so much harder to carry. The real value of your debt actually rises, while the broader prices and your personal income are shrinking. It is a brutal squeeze from both sides.
Act 3. The death spiral.
A little deflation might sound great to a consumer, but to a macroeconomist, it's the stuff of nightmares. Here's why. It builds into a terrifying cycle called the deflationary spiral. Think about it. If consumers expect things to be 5% cheaper next year, they freeze aggregate demand by delaying consumption today. I mean, why buy a TV now if it's going to be cheaper in 6 months? This delay leads to immediate drops in corporate profits. When no one buys, businesses are forced to cut wages and lay off workers. That rising unemployment leads to even less demand, and the cycle violently reinforces itself, spinning further and further downward.
And here is the fatal blow in this spiral: the rising real debt burden. While wages are falling right alongside price levels, your nominal debt obligations, like your fixed-rate mortgage or corporate bonds, stay exactly the same. This leads to widespread defaults and bank failures. Ordinary people and massive corporations alike suddenly find they can no longer service their loans with their diminished incomes, and the entire financial system begins cracking under the pressure.
Act 4. The real-world warning. If you think this is purely theoretical, think again. We can look to the relatively recent past to see just how hard it is to escape this trap once it snaps shut. After its massive asset bubble burst in 1991, Japan entered what we call the lost decades. They experienced prolonged stagnation and deflation that central bank policies struggled to break for over 20 years. They even pushed interest rates into negative territory in a desperate bid to force people to spend. But technological oversupply and a massive demand collapse created a deep economic freeze that completely paralyzed one of the most advanced economies on Earth.
The reason Japan struggled so much highlights a massive policy asymmetry. Managing inflation is relatively straightforward, at least in theory. You just raise interest rates to cool the economy down. But fighting deflation, that requires aggressive, unconventional, and often extreme measures. Central banks have to resort to quantitative easing, literal money printing, and relying on direct fiscal intervention by the government just to try and jumpstart the frozen gears of commerce.
And they have to take these extreme measures because of one terrifying mathematical limit: zero. Specifically, the zero lower bound. This is the reality that central banks simply cannot lower interest rates far below zero, leaving them practically powerless if the deflationary spiral takes deep root. Once borrowing costs hit rock bottom, traditional monetary policy completely runs out of ammunition. The central bank can no longer incentivize spending through rate cuts, leaving the economy totally stuck in the mud.
So the next time you wish for a broad drop in prices across the board, remember the heavy debt noodles of the deflationary trap. Ask yourself if the cure is actually worse than the disease. We all want our money to go further, sure, but knowing the crushing reality of the deflationary spiral and the mathematical dead end of the zero lower bound, do you still wish for prices to drop?